Hello everyone, welcome to lesson 113, day 3. Today we're going to be talking about more domain and range issues. So last week we had talked about this idea of what domain is and what range is, and we found that the easiest way to describe the domain and range was by looking at the graph of a function. All right, so real quick recap, and I summarized it here in a table for you, the different ways that we talk about domain and range. All right, so what the domain describes for a function is all of the allowable inputs. So you have this function, you have this rule. What are we allowed to put into that function and not get any errors? Okay, so we describe it as the allowable inputs. When we get a little bit more symbolic, we also describe it as the x values, right? Because usually a function has an x and a y value, and the domain tells you what values of x you're allowed to use, right? So what can you put in for the x? When we look at it graphically, right, when we talk about domains, since the x-axis runs left to right on a graph, we can quickly find the domain by asking ourselves how far to the left and how far to the right can we go on our function when we look at the graph. Like how far to the left does it go and how far to the right does it go? And we can usually figure out what our domain is by asking those two questions. All right. Now the range is very much like the domain, but it describes the other side of the function, which is the outputs, right? So it tells us what allowable outputs we can get from our function. All right, so remember, outputs are described by the variable y or sometimes f of x. So the range will tell us what kind of y values we can get out of a function. Okay. And to figure that out, when we look at a graph, the quickest way to figure out what the range is going to be is to ask ourselves how high and how low you can go on that graph. All right. So be careful when you look at a graph, because sometimes they don't draw in arrows, and we have to make assumptions about whether or not the graph continues on or does not continue on. All right, so that's a quick recap of domain and range from what we learned last week. So let's take a look at a graph and see if we can write some domain and ranges. Another reminder is that we learned two different ways to write the domain and range. One was called interval notation, one was called inequality, and I'll do both today so that you can see another example of those two. All right, so we have a graph over here, and you're going to notice something different about this graph from the ones that we looked at last week, in that this parabola does not keep on going forever and ever. In fact, it stops, and they put a very clearly defined point here and here at the ends of the parabola to let you know where this parabola is stopping. All right, and you'll also notice a difference between the two endpoints here. One of them is filled in and one of them is not. We call this a closed point, and this one is called an open point. All right, and what a closed point represents, it's telling you that on your parabola you can travel up to that point and actually touch the point. So that -2 is included in the domain. All right, so you can get up to and include it. That means you can touch that point. All right, but over here you have an open dot, which means you can get up to it, but you can't actually touch this point. All right, so you cannot include this in your domain or range. All right, so they're telling you when you go to write your domain and range, you might need one of the curved parentheses versus a square bracket, and that's how we handle these open dots and closed dots. All right, so let's start with the domain here for this function. So remember, domain is how far to the left and how far to the right you can go. So if I'm looking at this parabola, the point furthest to the left is this point right here, and you'll notice that I'm at -2. So I'm going to write my left bound. So there's my -2, and then the furthest to the right that I can go is actually at this point with the open dot. So that's at 3. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and write down a 3. All right, now remember, over here I can get up to and include this point. I can touch -2. So I'm going to put a square bracket indicating that the -2 is included in the domain. But over here at the 3, I can get up to, but I cannot touch this point. I can get infinitely close to it, but I cannot touch it. So 3 is not included, so the 3 is going to get a curved bracket or a parenthesis. All right, so that is how we do the domain for this one, right? Furthest to the left, furthest to the right, then determine what kind of bracket or parenthesis you need on each number. And the dots will tell you how to do that. All right, now let's write the same thing but in inequality notation. So remember up top we had talked about the domain describes x values. So I'm going to start with my x. Right, we're describing what x can be, and then I'm going to put in my inequality symbols. So I always kind of put my inequality symbols on both sides, just like this, right? And I put my left bound in, right? So we can get as far left as -2, and I can get as far right as +3 over here. And then to modify my symbols here, I ask myself, can I touch the -2? And the answer for this graph is yes, so I'm going to put an equal to bar underneath this one, right? Because I can be equal to the -2 because it's included. I can get there, I can touch it, so I need to make sure that x can also be equal to -2. But with the 3, we can't get to the 3, so I'm not going to put an equal to bar here because we have to be strictly less than 3. We can't be equal to 3. All right, let's do the range. So remember, range is low to high, right? So how low can we go? How high can we go? All right, so I'm going to start with low, and the lowest point on this parabola is way down here, and that is at -5, right? So I'm going to put in my lower bound first. And I want to make sure that I clarify something from last week. You have to go low, comma, high. Right? It has to go in that order to get it right on your quiz or your test or your homework. All right? Same thing with the domain range. It has to go left, comma, right. Has to go in that order, otherwise it'll be marked wrong. Okay? All right, now back to the range, right? We found our lowest point was at -5, and then our highest point on the parabola is actually up here. Okay, you see that point? That is the hilltop, that is as high as it goes, and it gets up to 4. So I'm going to put my 4 here as my upper bound, low, high. All right, now I got to figure out what kind of brackets and parentheses that I need on this thing, right? So remember, the -5 was down here, but we couldn't actually get to -5 because it's an open dot, so that one's going to require a curved parenthesis. Now the 4 we can actually get up to, right? All of these points, right? Even though we can't see defined points, any point along this parabola is a filled in point like this one, right? So we can actually get up to and touch the 4. So I'm going to put a square bracket on the 4. And there's my range. Now I'm going to do the same thing but in the inequality notation. Remember, this time, since we're talking about range, we're describing the y value, and I'm going to put my inequality symbols in there just like this, and I'm going to put my lower bound, which we found earlier, that was -5, and I'm going to put in my upper bound, which we found earlier, which was 4. Now remember, we couldn't get to the -5, so I'm going to leave the inequality symbol alone, but we could get to the 4, so I'm going to put my equal to bar underneath that inequality symbol. And there we go. There's my domain and range in both types of notations, and we learned about these open and closed dot situations. All right, let's take a look at the next example. And it's going to look very familiar, a little bit different than what we were dealing with in the last one. And I put this one side by side for the purpose of just recognizing the difference in that in our last example we had those endpoints which clearly marked the ends of the parabola, and you'll notice that this one does not have that. So this graph, we get to assume that it keeps on going forever and ever and ever, right? So this parabola is not going to stop going down. It's not going to stop getting wider. It just keeps on going, all right? So when we talk about the domain for this parabola, all right, we ask ourselves how far to the left and how far to the right it can go. Well, it never stops going off to the left. It's going to keep going down and to the left forever and ever and ever. So it's going to go all the way, along this axis. It's going to go all the way to -infinity. So I need to put a -infinity, and this was a big mistake on the quiz last week. A lot of people just put regular infinity here. When you go off to the left, you're going towards negative numbers, okay? Left on the x-axis, these are all negatives, right? So you're going off to -infinity. And similarly, on the right-hand side, this is going to go off to the right forever and ever, and these are all the positive numbers, right? So this is going to go off towards positive infinity. All right, and since you can never actually get to infinity in either direction, it's going to get curved brackets, right? Parentheses on those. So that's my domain. Now to write the same thing in inequality notation, I start the same way I always do. I put my x, since I'm describing x values, I put my inequality symbols, and then I put my left and my right bound. All right, so I'm going to put a -infinity here, positive infinity here, and I'll never be equal to either one of those two numbers, so I do not need equal to bars here. All right, now range, high to low, or sorry, low to high, right? I gotta get that in the right order. So how low does this thing go? Well, we just talked about this. It keeps going down forever and ever, right? So it's gonna go all the way down, and on the y scale, when you go down, those are all negative numbers there, so we're gonna go to negative infinity. Okay, so I'm gonna go negative infinity, comma, and then I gotta ask myself, how high does this parabola go? Well, the highest point's up here, right, at 4. So I'm gonna put a 4 for my upper bound. I will never get to negative infinity, so I need a curved bracket, but I do get to the 4, so I need a square bracket on the 4. And then I'm going to write this with the inequality notation. So I'm describing y. There's my two inequality symbols surrounding y. The lower bound on the left here, so I'm going to put that negative infinity in. And my upper bound on the right, which is going to be a 4. I can't get to negative infinity, so no equal to bar, but I do get to the positive 4, so I'm going to put an equal to bar here. All right, guys. Well, that concludes our lesson for today. Good luck. Try the practice problems. See if you can get the hang of writing that domain and range stuff. Let me know if you have questions in the Zoom chat.